I've I've tried to address in a preliminary way in the most recent book. But if we talk about French issues or Western European issues, for the most part, due to our limited expertise, and doesn't imply we regard Western Europe as a model, or more important than just a fault of our limited expertise. And this is a trans network. We've got Thomas at one people involved in France at issues of empire and colonial domination, and others who work. I just wanted to say that at the very beginning to start. So without further ado, we'll look at the questions that we circulated in advance and ask a different of our panel to start off a discussion of each of the questions. The first one was, what are emotions? Does adopting a current definition of emotions work if we want to do the history of emotions? For example, one derived from psychology or neuroscience. If not, what does work? And Barbara, I'd be grateful if you could launch the discussion of this. Your really interesting paper was on our reading list and directly addressed this question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I just want to welcome everybody. I see some of my students. Hello, it's wonderful to have you, as well as some of my friends. So what is an emotion, or what are emotions? Well, Bill, you gave us a handy definition in your navigation training. Emotions are goal-relevant activations of thought material that exceed the translating capacity of attention within a short time horizon. And, of course, we have Klein-Ginna and Klein-Ginna at the beginning of the 80s, who went around asking people, other psychologists, what are emotions, and they got 92 different answers. And then they tried to put together their own definition, a complex set of interactions among subjective and objective factors. And I think the really important point here is that there is no consensus about exactly what emotions are, even though when we have them, we know it. That means this is a really good time to be a historian of emotions, because we can add to the many definitions, the 92 definitions, and by now it's more than that. I can talk about the various breakdowns of those definitions, but I think the really important thing is emotions are something to do with feelings. We know them as we feel them, and as we feel them in others, and as we see them in others. And so we can help to fashion a definition. Yeah, I should talk about the different, there are two different notions. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. There are two different notions. You know that emotions are basically biological and physiological, hardwired, and then the notion that emotions are socially constructed and are therefore not at all hardwired, and most people are somewhere in between. But there has to be something there, or of course we aren't historians of anything at all. So there has to be something universal that we can call, whether we call it a feelings or passions or affects or whatever we'd like to call it. And there, I think from a historian's point of view, clearly many emotions that are, and the way that they are configured, are historically constructed, as Thomas Dodman's wonderful paper on nostalgia shows us.
I think, Barbara, you would probably also agree that there is a great deal of disagreement within psychology and neuroscience about what emotions are.
Well, that's what I mean. 92 different definitions of what an emotion is. We're just beginning to find out.
You can't just look at science, so to speak, and find a ready-made answer, because I think, in fact, I've argued that many neuroscientists are themselves in a grip of a particular historical tradition that treats, we could roughly call Asian dualism or some kind of Western dualism. It treats emotions as something, whereas, in fact, if we look across the globe, very rare for a language to permit one to distinguish between thought and emotion. Most languages don't make that distinction, even though they have all the languages I know about have rather rich emotional, what we would call emotional vocabularies.
Yeah, exactly. And as a matter of fact, we're beginning to get that by calling emotions cogmotions. Some people are beginning to move in that direction. And maybe in 100 years, that's what we'll talk about, cogmotions. Or maybe we'll have yet another word.
Yes, some other term.
Yeah.
There's a good number of experts who see cognition and emotion as inextricably intertwined. Crazy.
Right.
I don't know, is Piroska able to hear us? Piroska, can you talk?
She's able to hear. She's not able to right now get her image on screen or to have her voice heard. I'm working on it in the background.
Okay, Thomas, do you want to come in on this question?
Oh, you need to click your talk button, Thomas.
Can you hear me now?
Button. Yes.
Is that okay? Good. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't going to add that much to what Barbara said. I mean, I think her article does a really good job of showing how modest the historian has to be before the question, what is an emotion? I don't think we can, I mean, if the psychologists can't figure it out themselves and have 92 different versions of it, I don't think we're ever going to be able to give a better definition. I actually think that the tensions that Barbara illustrated there between the physical somatic aspect and the words we then use to describe emotions are precisely where we can actually step in and see the moments when that gap seems to shut or seems to open up in different historical moments. And that's exactly, I think, where the role of the historian comes in, to show where the process of socialization or social construction goes in one direction or in another. I think I'm fairly happy with accepting that there's some sort of chemical, physiological processes going on in my body, and that what I can then say something hopefully interesting about is simply how I interpret those at a given moment in time, and how other people interpret those at a given moment in time. The question of the rational thought versus emotional thought is a very, very big one, and I think we'll probably have to come back to it at the end of the discussion. I would actually want to put out there that we might not want to necessarily go towards cogmotion or sort of to an absolute fusion of the two. I think there might be something worth keeping about a distinction there, but I think that's probably a question that we can get back to afterwards, maybe.
Thomas, would you compare work in the history of emotions to working in the history of medicine? Is there a ready between the concept of a disease and the concept of an emotion as a historian approaches?
Is there a what? Say the second part?
Is it easy? Is it appropriate to compare the concept of an emotion as a historian should approach it to the concept of a disease as a historian should approach it? In other words, where one And we have a fear independent of the definitions of fear, the approaches to fear that were used at specific times in the past. I mean, is it useful for us to have such a notion?
I think it depends. Yeah, I mean, I think it obviously depends on what period and what time. I mean, there are plenty of people who've written very interesting and very eloquent things on nostalgia in the contemporary world that aren't very much aware of its medical past, and I don't think they necessarily need to be aware of it. However, obviously going a bit back in time, we sort of inevitably stumble upon the fact that emotions were through and through medical concepts, passions, etc., movements of the soul, and I think Thomas Dixon obviously is the reference in that respect for historicizing the moment where we move away from a more medical paradigm to a less medical one, among other things. So I think there's definitely a lot to be gained by looking at the medical literature on emotions, and to treating them to a certain extent as a disease, as many people at various points in time did. I don't necessarily think it's obligatory. I wouldn't say that a historian of emotions has to necessarily get a training as a medical historian. I don't have a training.
I don't mean it that way. What I mean is just that in methodological terms, one approaches a disease recognized by Galenic medicine as something very complicated and not necessarily related to anything we would recognize as a disease today. And
right.
Likewise, perhaps one should treat emotions of the past in a similar fashion, or not.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for example, I don't think there's that much of a difference between a functional MRI scan today or a scientific model of emotions today and Descartes' models of the pineal gland and the way that the brain functioned 300 years ago. So I think it is certainly useful to have in mind some methodology that we might get from history of medicine, and some models, some explanatory models that we may get from history of medicine to be able to map out the trajectories of emotions over time, definitely.
Darrin, do you have any remarks you want to make on this, or?
You need to turn your microphone on, Darrin. You need to turn your microphone button on, your talk button. Darrin, we're not hearing your voice. Try clicking on your talk button if you can.
Oh, darn.
Well, okay, I'll try to figure out what's going on with Darrin. Bill, you might want to go ahead and continue.
All right. Well,
one thing that I would add, maybe, Bill, is that I think a lot of people that get into the history of emotions, either directly or peripherally, if I may say, are very interested in the question of embodiment, right, of emotions. That it might be a way to sort of move possibly beyond the linguistic determinism of cultural history really sort of put forefront. And there, obviously, medical history of medicine, medical texts, and medical approaches are crucial, because we can't understand how people talked about emotions without understanding precisely, as you were saying, the vocabulary and the categories used within that specific medical discourse at a given time. So that aspect of embodiment, I think, is one that necessarily goes by a certain familiarity with the medical tradition.
I'm going to try to speak again. Can people hear me?
Yeah. Very good. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what I was clicking the button. I did want to sort of build, I think it might be useful for some of the graduate students. I think all history graduate students are going to be very comfortable with a notion of historical construction and historical discontinuity, and I think we'll quickly assume that, yes, emotions are constructed different ways in different societies, different times. but it might be useful just to sort of stress that there is a kind of universalist view, right? And that that has, I would argue, a certain degree of weight. That there are sort of constant emotions in the human family, and that these are given different expressions in different times and different places, and yet in the same way that facial features for basic emotions can be shown or argued that they're universal across cultures, there is a view that would say that, well, in fact, there are constant emotions, even if most historians of emotions don't tend to share that.
Darrin, we have a question in the chat box you might want to bring in.
Okay. All right, so I'm getting a question here from Christopher Schilling. Should I just read it out or turn over to Christopher?
No, go ahead and read it out.
Okay, so Christopher asked, if current definitions of emotions are largely constructions, what does this say about historical definitions of emotions? Do we apply the same sort of logic we're using here, or do we have to come up with some new theoretical structure for different eras? That's an excellent question.
Barbara, do you have a response?
Yeah. Sure. What?
Oops, I can't hear Barbara.
I've lost Barbara as well. Yeah.
Barbara, can you click your talk button again?
Yes. What I'd like to suggest is that we not worry so much about having an objective theory of emotion, as we're historians of emotion, but simply recognize that the concept itself has changed, that the various entities that belong within that concept have changed over time, and that what we need to do is immerse ourselves in the period that we're studying, understand its own logic and its terms and its science and its philosophy and its theory, and sometimes really its art and its music. If we want to get at the embodiment, I think that these are other ways to do that, and not worry so much about definitions. I just think that could end up being a very arid kind of enterprise. I'm more interested in how emotions have been theorized than in theorizing them myself. And I think that you can even tease out the theories from very concrete kinds of materials, as long as you keep an open mind and the possibility that emotions are being viewed in ways that we don't view them today.
Very good. I will say that I think that, if we go about this starting from at least a loosely constructionist point, anticipating our discussion a little bit, if we are thinking in terms of studying emotional communities, we can grasp the political implications of various ways of expressing emotions, various norms about how emotions. I don't want to lose hold of that thread. There are political implications to how emotions are construed and how they are expressed and what kinds of norms and ideals are imposed or accepted. And these implications are often very blunt, very drastic for some members of society. So I want to hold on to that, and I think it's crucial holding on to that to remember that emotions are fashioned by people, just as other aspects of culture are, and that this fashioning changes over time. David,
the fashioning changes. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say the fashioning changes over time as the groups in power change over time. So
yes, as a function of very often as a function of political conflict and ups and downs, struggles of one kind or another. Perhaps, Darrin, is there another graduate student?
No one with a hand raised right now, but I know that we have several students who are going to just briefly sort of talk about their work, and for the rest of people on board, the way we were conceiving this is a kind of like in a seminar where you, at the beginning, people sort of introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work as a way of kind of integrating themselves in the discussion. So I have Hannah Wellman and Sarah Hidalgo, who are both prepared to do this. If any, either Sarah or Hannah would like to come on and speak for a little bit.
Hannah, if you can, yeah, Hannah and Sarah, if you can both go ahead and click your microphones and your video buttons. Barbara, I'm going to take you and Thomas off screen just briefly so that we have a better connection. So Hannah and Sarah, if you're there, go ahead and click your talk button and then click your video buttons that are below all of our images.
Bill and I will hum.
Hannah, are you there? Hannah Wellman?
There we go.
We have Piroska.
Welcome.
Can you speak, Piroska?
I see.
And here is Sarah.
Sarah Hidalgo. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Sarah.
Sarah, can you tell us about your project?
I don't hear.
Sarah, can you tell us about your project?
Yes. Okay. My research project studies the emotional making of the working class in Spain at the end of 19th century. And I analyze what are the emotions which make the socialist emotional regime. Moreover, I analyze what emotives shape socialist class consciousness and their emotional regime. And for doing so, I pay attention to the workers' practices. And according to my research, I can say that socialist emotional regime disarms the 19th century emotional regime referring to the workers. This emotional regime is led by the bourgeois, partly supported by hygienic theories, which were defining workers as disgusting and dangerous. The socialist emotional regime is formed by emotives of indignation and rage, as well as solidarity and pride. Along the end of the 19th century, these emotions shape socialist identity, dignifying workers. So this is my PhD project, and which I am doing at the University of the Basque Country in Spain.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So you're using Bill's concept of an emotional regime in your project. It sounds like wonderful. Good. Hannah, are you there? Hi, welcome to the group.
Oh, can you click your talk button?
What?
We have you now, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm Henning Bellmann. I'm at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin.
Great.
My project is about anger in music. So my whole research group is about emotion in music, and I specifically take a look at how anger is expressed and negotiated, embodied, and so on in recent music culture since the 1970s. And I guess I'm very much interested in all the historical research in emotions, but actually I'm not a historian, but more of a cultural studies guy. And so basically I have a question or a thought I'm pursuing right now, that maybe it's good to have a more comprehensive view on emotions, like not only the direct emotions, but also taking into account the whole process of Foucault might call subjectification. And so you have a look at the social practices which are involved in showing emotions and living emotions, and also in the discourses like framing the social practices and framing ideas about emotions, and as well as that how emotions play political roles, and how politics are involved in processes of showing emotions, dealing with emotions, thinking about emotions, and so on.
Are you working
especially in
music?
Yeah.
Are you working on pop music?
Yes. Basically, since punk music came along, which was a big revolution in showing emotions and presenting emotions in a rather radical way, and that was like real, a new thing to do in pop music or culture, to be angry like that and that openly, and so focused on anger and not other emotions.
Thank you, Hannah. That's wonderful, and I'm sure there are many more interesting projects out there. And unfortunately, we can't go around the whole room because there are quite a number of us. But we thought it would be useful just to have a sense that there are lots of people doing interesting projects out there. Bill, I'll turn it back to you at this stage.
I'm very pleased that both of the participants here were talking about projects with real significance, and one dealing with an area that is a standard feature of cultural studies, and the other dealing with good old-fashioned working class history. In both cases, we can see that thinking of emotions gives a dimension to gives us something new to say about topics that have been carefully researched in the past. Have you been able to hear the discussion that we've been having so far, and do you have any remarks about the first question on our list that we circulated? Piroska, can you?
You might try to hit your talk button as well, Piroska. We can't hear you.
Try hitting it now.
Yes, perhaps.
There we go.
Very good.
Wow. What happened? So, miracle.
Wonderful. Have you been able to hear so far how the discussion is?
More or less, I didn't hear everything. The sound is not so good, so sometimes I'm missing parts. The image is okay, I see you, but sometimes I'm missing the sound.
Well, it's great that you can hear us. It's fantastic. So, do you have anything to make any remarks about the first question or any of the discussion we've had so far? What concept of emotion?
I don't. Yeah, it's okay. Because I was not totally able to have everything, so I think it's okay that I jump in now.
Maybe we can move to our second question then, which was, how can the rise of interest in the history of emotions? Piroska, could you start on that question?
Yeah. So, well, the first thing to say, I would say, would be that emotions were for a long time quite absent of historical explanations, and which were history more of reason. So I think that the rise of interest for a history of emotions is also one of the reasons. Certainly is because of its quite novelty. Now we have to think about how new it is. So is it something that has been invented recently, or emotions were there, just perhaps we didn't deal with them in the same way as Barbara would have said it in her worrying about emotions, that emotions there were in history, but not in the good way. So that's one thing, certainly. The second thing would be that emotions history emerged in a whole scientific context, the one you were speaking about, I think, around the first question too. That's what we can call the cognitive revolution. So this is the question: how far emotions history is a product also of the cognitive revolution you spoke about. I heard that about the cogmotions, and the question is also: can emotions be reduced to cogmotions, or are there parts of emotions which are, or perceptions of emotions, or how to say, let's say parts of emotions that cannot be theorized by that term. Then also I would say also we can look at this question also in a civilizational explanation, that our societies speak a lot about emotions, certainly in relation with the cognitive revolution, but is this, and that would be the question I put, is this the only reason for which emotions are so interesting for people who are not conscious of the cognitive revolution at all? Like, you know, it's spoken about emotional intelligence or emotions in all kind of contexts, therapeutic contexts or marketing contexts and all that. So this would be my first comments. I'm not sure it's I am in what you expected, but it's like an opening for seeing why there is such a rise of interest for a history of emotions. Certainly, emotions also come after the history of the body as an excroissance, something that comes as how to say, was raising as a first as an annex, of which history of the body did not really know what to do in the 80s, and in a second time as something that complemented and that gives new perspective to questions that we were dealing with already from another point of view.
Piroska, I have a question from the field. If Aaron, and I'm forgiving the pronunciation, Aaron, is it Suchek? I'd like to ask a question. If you'd like to go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, that was actually pretty close. It's Suchek. But yeah, and I saw references to emotional communities and emotional regimes in a number of the different readings, and it's been mentioned a few times so far today. And I was actually wondering if we could maybe elaborate on those two concepts a little bit more, those two conceptualizations of emotions within society. I was wondering if, in particular, if the two had to be considered mutually exclusive to each other. Could there be an emotional regime and emotional communities, or yeah.
I know that that's actually our next question on the agenda, or at least part of it. But Bill, I don't know how you want to proceed, or Piroska, if you want to go there now, or
let's see. Maybe Parker can come in on this question right now, since it's been raised, and we can cover the rest of the question 2 as we go along.
Sure.
Barbara,
are you there?
Mm-hmm.
David has removed your.
Can you hear me? You can
video.
hear me now?
Yeah. We can hear you, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm really delighted you asked that question, because I've wanted to say for a long time that I don't think that those two notions are exclusive at all. I think of emotional community, some of them are dominant, some of them are regimes, especially in the modern period. But I think that at any given time, there's more than one. Although Bill Reddy talks about emotional regimes and refuges, the refuges are sort of reacting against the regime, whereas I think people sometimes follow the beat of their own drummer, and they have emotional communities that are quite particular to their interests and their world, rather distant from the emotional regime. But I do think that an emotional regime can be an emotional community, an emotional community can be an emotional regime. I hope that makes sense. Because if a community is dominant, then it seems to me it is ultimately it can be called a regime.
Thomas, can you hear us? Thomas Dodman, maybe you could talk a little bit about the politics of nostalgia in the.
I've let myself back in. I hope that's okay.
The French, 19th century French army had a way of talking about nostalgia. Would you think that concepts of emotional community or emotional regime are helpful for thinking about that? Or
yeah, absolutely. I think both. I agree that at least the way I would use these terms is very much one of not quite synonyms, but very sort of broad analytical categories that help us to address similar kinds of problems. In the case of nostalgia, what's interesting to me is that it's really the absence of an emotional community that sparks an emotional reaction that is deemed pathological at the time. So I think one very interesting thing to do with emotional communities, and also, I think Bill does it already with the opposition between an emotional regime and an emotional refuge, is that it's interesting to look at both the community and the absence of a community or the counter community. And I think the student I can remember before who was looking at punk music, this is a perfect example of emotions that are challenging emotional communities and creating counter emotional communities. So I absolutely think that these are categories that can be used and we should use. I think it's also interesting to reflect on how they maybe help us also address the question that Piroska was answering before as to the how do we account for the current rise of interest in history of emotions, because it's not exactly something new. I mean, Lucien Febvre, of course, wrote about the need for a histoire du sensible and what could be an histoire des émotions already in the late 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't think he was necessarily looking so much at questions of communities. It was really more how do we bring the psychological aspect into what was already a well-established sociological perspective at the time. So it seems to me almost as if the problem has shifted and the search for emotional communities and emotional regimes and refuges belies maybe a recognition of the fact that we live in a very sort of atomized society where individualism is extremely important, and we therefore sort of are brought to look for forms of emotional bonding. I think that's an interesting thing to think about as to explain the specific form that in the history of emotions has taken in the last 10, 15 years when it's really sort of come back to the fore.
Let's say, Piroska, do you want to talk about emotional communities for a minute?
Yeah, I do totally agree with what Tom Dodman has said. So I think also that our current society, I would say, individual emotional needs explain for a big part the popularity of emotions on every level. People 100 years ago, or even our grandfathers, did not really think about their emotional life as such. Well, that is surely one question. So one question I frequently meet when I am speaking about emotions in the Middle Ages is, did the people really think about anything concerning their emotions, and was it a category in some way for them? So these are questions to answer. How in fact, emotion and emotional life or affective life is integrated in the wholeness of human life on an individual level and also on the social level. And that's sure that it's not at all the same things today than 100 years ago, and of course even less 5 or 100 years ago.
Yeah. So it seems to me that the sense about the idea of emotional community, these emotional regimes, is that we're able to read about, study. There are emotional norms and emotional ideals, and they are inculcated in young people, are used to measure and grant status, measure individuals and grant them status, and or to exclude individuals who can't live up to them. And so this occurs in any community that where emotions have been studied as a community phenomenon. And so I think it makes sense to talk about an emotional regime if you have a root community that is monopolizing or garnering a great deal of political power. These norms and standards, these ideals have begun to acquire political significance, and being able to live up to them will determine whether one can get elected, or whether one becomes a influence, or whether one becomes a favored wife in the harem, and so on and so forth. And so I think we need to remember that emotional expression everywhere is a question of effort. Run across a single case where it was not thought to be, emotional expression was not thought to be effortful in some way. And that's why it both makes sense to talk about emotional regimes, for me anyway, and emotional refuges, and both of them in terms of a community.
Bill, I actually had
people strike.
Sorry, there was a pause. I thought you finished. I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue.
No, I was finishing.
Okay. There's a question here from Julia Thomas, which actually follows nicely on this. She writes that I was interested in the earlier comments regarding the medical model of emotions as disease and the norms and ideals of what is accepted. How might the growing interest in the history of emotions play a part in the current, at times emotionally charged power relationship that often exists between a scientific research community researching mental illness such as mood disorders and the members of the emotional communities upon which it carries out its research? Anyone would like to come in on that? There's a lot there. Did you grasp that? I can read it again.
Yeah, could you read it again, Darrin? That would be.
So how might the growing interest in the history of emotions play a part in the current, at times emotionally charged power relationship that often exists between a scientific research community researching mental illness such as mood disorders and the members of the emotional communities upon which it carries out its research?
Yes, well, all of us study the more or less distant past, but does anyone want to come in on this question?
I would just, I'm willing to say that I think historians can show how those emotional power relations worked in the past, and that might be helpful for us to understand what's going on today. Of course, the question is whether the mood disordered person wishes to join the emotional community or the emotional regime of the scientists. And there are good reasons to want to do that. But on the other hand, I think that historians can give insight into how certain groups have refused. Of course, the medical model is less easy for me to talk about than, for example, the ecclesiastical model, where I see, for example, Gregory the Great having certain emotional norms and wanting to impose those on those that he considers sinful. And it's all for their good. And, of course, we've got the same kinds of issues, I think, in the modern world. The question is it for their good? Is it, in fact, a good idea to conform? And that, I think, is a moral question rather than a scientific or historical question. But I think historians can show in the past how these relationships have worked, and that they help give insight into the present, and also maybe if therapists are sensitive to it, actually allow therapists to loosen up a little bit so that certain kinds of things would be more accepted. I notice that autism is a little bit more accepted now that there is that wonderful woman whose name I have forgotten, who understands cattle and who has worked up marvelous ways for the cattle to go to their slaughter. And we have become aware of the positives in autistic behavior and ways of thought and feeling.
Yes, anyone, Thomas? Or...
Yeah, I would just add very, very briefly that I think if there's anything that the history of emotions can do is show that emotions have a historicity, and that at some points they might have been diseases and then they weren't anymore. And therefore, conversely, anybody who has a mental disorder, what is deemed to be a mental disorder now, especially a mood, a sort of mild neurosis mood disorder, in 100, 200, 300 years' time might be considered somebody who's perfectly sane. And so we might have to think about why these people are locked up, and what we are doing or not doing to sort of to help them, or rather stop viewing them as pathological, in a pathological state, I mean.
And of course, this is such a real issue when you look at successive editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychologists use to classify diseases. And, 5 years later, oops, we lost that one and gained another. I have a question from Gary O'Neill, if Gary wants to come in. And then I have another one.
Gary, can you click your video button and your talk button below the screen? That should bring you on.
Okay, am I here?
Very good.
Hi, I had a question for Professor Reddy about emotional regimes and refuges. And I was wondering if this configuration is produced only in times of like dramatic, in response to kind of a dramatic event where you have a very repressive regime necessitating emotional refuges, or if he sees this configuration being applicable to kind of calmer times, or like to Western society today, like if you see this dynamic being played out throughout history, or only kind of in these epochal moments.
Well, that's easy. I don't think that there's any special time when you would expect to find people looking for emotional refuges, as I called them in my 2011. In other words, places where the usual standards are not applied, and where one can be less guarded in one's expressions and behaviors. I think that's a general desideratum that almost all people feel to one degree or another. Of various ways in which this longing is realized in different societies. I do think that the more rigidly an emotional standard is imposed on people, the more strongly they will long for periods of time off. But whether they will get them is another question. Does that address your question adequately? I know it's sticking with generalizations, but
yeah, I was just wondering if you could identify any refuges like in Western society today, or if you consider that like the society to have achieved such a state where conflict between goals has kind of obviated the need to have refuges. Oh
my gosh! Well, I don't know how to answer you in 25 words or less. I mean, obviously, modern industrial societies, there are industries that try to provide people with a leisure time context in which they can relax their self-surveillance to one degree or another. But of course, if you are pursuing a career in such an industry, what is a refuge for someone else can become a system of norms for yourself. You know, if you are going to be a successful musician, you need to be able to express anger in a very effective way, a certain kind of anger in a very effective way, where someone who is a consumer of that product may find that this expression of anger is satisfactory to them as a kind of giving them a moment of relaxation, of vigilance, because they actually spend their days working in a law office, for example. So, I mean, in other words, it would be very difficult figuring out exactly refuge for who and to what degree. Do you follow me?
Thank you.
Maybe we can suggest the history departments are emotional refuges for some of us or not. I have another question here, Bill, from Kimberly Lawton, which I put in your chat box if you want to actually see it written out. But Kimberly asks, how can we tell when a society being studied is actually speaking of emotions or explaining a condition not well understood at the time, such as mental illness, through emotional language? Does this difference matter in the history of emotions?
I'm going to see if someone else wants to come in on that. Thomas, Piroska.
Thomas or Piroska, you want to take a stab?
I'm thinking about it. Piroska, do you have some immediate thoughts?
Piroska, you need to click your talk button.
So the question is just for the rest of us again, while Piroska gets that sorted. Do you have it, Piroska? You're not quite.
We can't hear. Yeah.
How can we tell when a society being studied is actually speaking of emotions or some other mental illness through emotional language? And the question is whether this difference, does it matter in the history of emotions?
I'm not sure I see where the difference is.
Well, that would be one answer, right? Do you want to elaborate on that, Thomas?
I guess I have to now, don't I? Well, I think the form of the sources maybe this is sort of a way of getting into the next question about how does one actually get to emotions, what context these emotions or mental illnesses are being spoken of in, who is authoring statements about this particular condition. I'm not sure if that's really answering the question. I suspect not.
Let me just add one thing, which is I think that historians should not police ourselves so much as to say, maybe that's not really history of emotions. Maybe that's history of mental states and it's something else. I don't think that we need to draw hard and fast boundaries. We can keep an open mind. Nothing is just emotion. The emotions are always connected to some other things, generally goals, and also, as we've been talking about, political interests and moral interests. And I would say, if you're interested in something and then go for it and look at what you think you can say is emotional, but also look at what you think you can say is non-emotional or something slightly different, and not worry about it. I don't think the history of emotion should be separated out from all other kinds of histories. Indeed, in my view, the best thing would be for it to be integrated.
Yes.
Piroska has her hand up. Go ahead, Thomas. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. Sorry, Piroska, go ahead. You've got your hand. I forgot mine. There you go.
We need sound for Piroska.
Piroska, can you click your talk button right below all the images?
Still can't hear you, Piroska.
Now, perhaps?
Yes.
Okay. So it is, I agree with what Barbara said, and it is just an addition to this question. So the question puts a kind of dichotomy between the emotional language, which would be an interpretative framework for something that could be a mental illness seen from another point of view. But what I would say is that what we see as mental illnesses, as we have seen it in the last minutes, are also changing. That's what Thomas Dodman said and showed us in this article. So what is important is also to relativize, because, for instance, those who were considered as holy women and men in the Middle Ages today would appear as total crazy people. So what can be considered as a mental illness is really, really changing. That's all.
Yes, and I would say it's very significant to try to sort this question out to some degree because of the political implications that follow one person's mental illness. I mean, to say something is or is not a mental illness is to apply or not a very judgmental attitude towards a way of expressing emotions, for example. And so there obviously are very strong, very clear political implications to that kind of judgment. So if there is something that would undoubtedly be today by current psychiatrists, present-day psychiatrists, we shouldn't take that as absolute authority. We can't afford to take that as a final question. We have to say what's going on. And as Piroska says, we may find a strong reversal attitudes. There's a well-known study of the 1980s by an anthropologist named Obeah Sekere, that what Westerners call depression in Buddhist texts regarded as the threshold of enlightenment, just as an example.
Piroska, did you want to come back again? You had your hand up?
Just an addition to what Bill is saying, that yes, it is a normative category, and not even all the criticism that has been expressed in the last year around the DSM-5 shows that what was no mental illness 10 years ago can be categorized today as such, and it puts a series of problems.
Yeah.
And shows also problems in society. That was my addition.
Very good, thanks. Darrin, should we move on to the fourth question, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add very briefly that, of course, as all the historians of emotions here know very well, too, even to describe something as an emotion was a political charge. And, of course, Hegel and others always opposed passion and reason. And if it falls in the category of the passions, then it's not to be taken seriously. And hence one of the reasons why history of emotions hasn't been studied until relatively recently. So that sort of political tension is embedded in the history of emotions itself.
We're using, yeah. Our fourth question is: do the emotions of particular individuals fit into the history of emotions? If so, why? If not, why? Yes, and I'll just mention that I've already talked about this in the course of our discussion, that I think individuals are expected to conform to emotional standards. In virtually all communities where the matter has been studied. And because of that, raise the question of sincerity or authenticity is problematic. We certainly accept the Freudian view, which is in perfect accord with current neuroscience, that people are deeply ambivalent. We feel many things all at the same time, and which one we will end up expressing is very much a function of social context, cultural common sense, and which ones we will strive to feel more strongly, determined very much by our context. So I don't think we should be chasing the will of the wisp of what someone really felt or what they authentically felt in a given moment. Very often there is no such object to search for. Does anyone else want to come in on this? Barbara.
Well, I think that especially a medievalist has to think that the emotions of particular individuals fit into the history of emotions, because sometimes that's all we have to tell us about a larger group. But rather than do psychohistory, which is, I think, what the model had been, where we're just looking at the personal pathology, if you will, of an individual, we can take an individual as speaking for or as representative of a group, whether it's an emotional regime, refuge, or community, and run with that, exploit that, look at all the writings, if that person has sketched out pictures too, music, if it's been, I mean, everything that person has left behind could be very fruitful for study of the history of emotions, even though we're not looking at that person qua that person, just as, okay, what makes that person tick? And I think we'll be getting at something even more interesting than what makes that person tick, if we can ever figure out what makes a person tick anyway. So I think emotions of particular individuals, absolutely, they fit.
Thomas, you want to come in on this?
You know, I absolutely agree with what Barbara just said, that one of the obvious paths to take in this field is studying an individual of which we have a lot of sources, a lot of written letters, a lot of ego documents of various kinds that can really help us piece together an extremely rich emotional economy within which this particular individual lived. I think that the individual and the collective, the emotional community, and the individual experience have to really be looked at together. I mean, I think the two necessarily are intertwined, and precisely a psychohistory, as Barbara said, of an individual is doomed to fail, just like a collective history of various people without paying any attention to the psychological aspect is also inadequate. So I think both sides of the equation are absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that a concept I like to use is whether a particular emotional expression works for someone. So, for example, I might ask with regard to one of your soldiers, Thomas, did the nostalgia diagnosis work? Did he recognize himself as having nostalgia? Now, you might not be able to answer that for any particular soldier, although you might, if you found the right kind of document.
Right.
But I'm wondering if that would be a more fruitful way of thinking about the individual's.
Yeah, I think the individual, the micro scale, is necessary precisely to be able to identify differences in response and belonging to different kinds of emotional communities. often, though, I mean, at least this is what turns out to be the case with nostalgia, is that this is a very technical medical term that no soldier really ever uses or wants to be diagnosed with at all. So, but what's interesting there is precisely to see the absence of a recognition as a piece of information too, and it can lead to discussions of codes of manly behavior that are beginning to crystallize and that precisely foreclose any possibility to admit to one's homesickness. So I think
there was sufficient knowledge among the troops that they could think about kind of working up some nostalgia so they could get a period back home.
Well, that fear, there's constantly that fear among the physicians, but they have a very elaborate way of identifying who's the malingerer and who's the genuine. And precisely the genuinely nostalgic soldier never actually admits to his nostalgia because he doesn't want to appear weak. So, I mean, obviously, there we get to questions of what are people really feeling, and what are the categories that people describing the feeling are, I think Barbara was saying this before, that we can't pass judgment upon this issue here. We have to take what the historical actors were saying as meaningful to them, and obviously apply a critical look onto it. But I believe physicians, when they say that this particular soldier is suffering from something and we have to take it seriously and we have to send him home. Again, the individual experience is very important, and it will depend so much on the particular emotional community in which that person has been raised and responds to.
Piroska and Barbara, both of you, I'd like to ask you, with reference to this question, about the sudden shift of medieval men and women from hostility to friendship, from hatred to love. Seems to be a very important question for medievalists right now, and I've seen a good number of discussions of this, and I'm wondering whether you both can help us understand what kind of framework do we need to understand these changes. I mean, obviously, in the past, they've been regarded as fake, whereas merely a question of behavioral scripts and not really something that was felt. What do you think, Piroska?
Two things I would say. One would be that these oppositions work really in societies of honor, and I really love the article of Cheyette and his colleague because it gave a very different light on a question about which I have already read a lot of things in social history, but not in literature. So bringing together the two was really interesting. And the other thing is, so for me, it's really societies of honor, where, and that's the second thing I would say, where demonstration of emotions and feelings were not far away as they are for us. So a lot of works have showed this, that our idea of emotion as a very internal, very intimate something that we don't easily express, and it is something that doesn't work for medieval lay society and the way it expresses its feelings, be it anger, be it love, or what was it, hatred. So that would be what I would say. It's really, for me, it's one proof which is really important, that it's not only the representation of emotions which changes through time, but also the way people lived their affective life. So there was real historical change. There is historical change in emotions and not only in representations. When you see
would you say that in the early Middle Ages, it was in Francia, for example, that it was more prestigious to be a person seen as changeable, that a higher ranking was a person who rapidly switched from amnesia to.
I would not say that. I would not necessarily say that it was prestigious, but that for someone who was of a certain rank, that was something that was accepted. That's how I see it.
So you might figure that your loyalties were better attached to someone who was what we would call irascible, or
mine. Mine, I don't know.
Okay, not yours.
What and what? How are the loyalties of Barbara, as you are speaking about early medieval persons?
Yes. You say,
well, I don't think you're speaking about the early Middle Ages. I think you're speaking about the high and the late Middle Ages, and you're speaking about a certain kind of knightly culture. Let me bring in someone we haven't talked about, but who we owe due acknowledgement, and that is Peter Stearns, who wrote a great, really pioneering article called Emotionology about the changing standards of emotional expression and which emotions should be expressed. And he has a very nice book called American Cool, in which he outlines the new emotional temperature really of today in the United States and in the Western world, where emotions are not shown very, very strongly. Indeed, one is cool in one's expression of emotions. One does not switch from royal anger to great joy in 2 minutes. But I would say that we find it difficult to understand the medieval, what seems vacillation and has been understood as childish vacillation, the way a child will have a temper tantrum and then become happy as soon as he or she gets a candy. I think that we have lost our ability to appreciate that what was going on in the high and later Middle Ages amongst certain classes was a certain kind of non-cool temperature, emotional temperature, that, yes, it was seen as prestigious, it was seen as good, it was seen as making sense, making good sense. And I think for historians, it's best to try to figure out why it makes sense than to worry about whether it's odd.
Yeah, for example, we could say when Henry II of England had Becket killed and then turned around and he's begging for forgiveness for this, we could say he was acting royally, he was acting as a great lord. Is that too, am I pushing it?
Well, I think that it is more complicated than that. And I like Stephen White's analysis of what he calls the script or sequence of emotions that don't go immediately from anger to joy. But there are a few emotions in between, like grief, for example, compassion, sometimes weeping. And there's an interaction very often. I think it's too simple to talk about anger and joy. It doesn't work that fast. But it doesn't work with quite the intermediaries that we have. We also go from anger to joy. There's no question about it. Think about husbands and wives having an argument. We go from anger to joy. But we do it in a different way, and we don't think about ourselves as being like medieval lords. So I think that it's not as simple as just vacillation. It is often, as Cheyette and Chickering show, carried out by intermediaries who are putting certain kinds of social pressures on the parties. And I think we have to recognize the medieval Latin vocabulary, and to some extent the vernacular vocabulary is less emotionally rich than our own vocabulary, although the other possibility is that they recognize emotions that we don't know are emotions.
Before we run out of time, I'd like to ask Thomas, if I might, a little bit about his experience of dissertation project in the history of emotions. Thomas, did you work in the history of emotions when you were doing your research initially, starting your research, or was this something that you found your way into in a certain fashion?
No, absolutely not. And here I rejoin something that Barbara was saying earlier, that I don't think people should worry about emotions, to borrow from her wonderful title of her article, and worry about whether they're doing the history of emotions or not. At some point, they'll probably come across an instance where a particular category, a particular concept, or a particular approach will be useful to make sense of what they're doing. I certainly didn't start out on my project thinking I was working on the history of emotions. I thought this was an old school labor history project that I was doing, just sort of post-cultural history. And it obviously evolved in many different directions. And at some point, very late in the game, the history of emotions, in growing literature and interest for, suddenly provided me with some sort of a narrative structure and a methodological framework to working, and a set of questions to actually address. So I think, increasingly people, I think, are going to be working on emotions from the get-go, but I don't think one should necessarily worry about about framing one's work specifically as a history of emotions project. I tend to, very much like Barbara was saying before, I think that this should be the purchase in the long run of your work, Bill, Barbara's work, and Piroska's work and many other people's work, is really to integrate emotions within a toolkit of objects of study and categories of analysis that the historian, the sort of general social cultural historian, should be interested in.
Barbara, do you, or Piroska, do you have or know of people working on dissertations who have framed their project in terms of history of emotions? Do you have any words of advice for people who are thinking along these lines? Barbara, you.
Yes, I have a number of people working on the history of emotions, dissertation projects, post-doctorate projects, and my advice is be open to your sources and see what they say, and don't worry too much about whether this is really a history of emotions or whatever. Like Michelangelo with his Carrara marble, you will discover the image right in your materials.
Yeah. Piroska, do you want to?
It would be something like what Barbara said. It's about, it's to be extremely attentive to the categories that the sources are constructing themselves. The way in a given period people describe their experiences, conceptualize their categories, and try to understand that as something that can be really different from our ways of speaking and conceiving something that seems to us a very similar experience in our life. And certainly this. And I would say something that is just one more thing, that it is in fact quite difficult, the interdisciplinarity of history of emotions. So that's it's a good reading, but I would say for a historian, come back to your sources. I am very, very conservative saying that.
Darrin, offer any words on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I like very much thinking of the analogy of sort of gender history, that in the same way that one doesn't have to be a gender historian to incorporate perspectives, theoretical or practical, on gender dynamics into one's work. I think it's the same is very much true in the history of emotions. And I would say that, in fact, that was my experience, that I'm an intellectual historian by training, and I think it's fair to say that the kind of real impetus behind the history of emotions originally was coming from social historians, and that intellectual historians have a lot to learn from historians of emotion, and perhaps vice versa. And so I think all to the good, and that graduate students shouldn't worry, as everyone has said, too much about categorizing themselves as one label. One can wear different hats, and in fact, it's often useful to do that for professional reasons. To wear a history of emotions hat and another, depending on the circumstance of the situation.
Bill, are we running out of time?
About 5-6 minutes left.
Okay. I don't know if you wanted to get to the fifth question or not.
Yeah, go ahead. The question was, how can history of emotions contribute to our knowledge of history? For example, how are emotions involved in historical change? Oops, we don't want to forget that.
It's a big question. It's difficult to. But I don't know if there were any sort of concluding statements that you wanted to engage in. But I mean, I would just very, very briefly point towards it's already been mentioned, but Barbara and Piroska's work, I think, show how all of a sudden you can fundamentally change studying emotions can fundamentally change how people apprehend the Middle Ages, a whole big period, for example, or Peter Stearns' work that Barbara mentioned more recent, just in the previous intervention for the more recent period. But I also think that there can be more subtle, more nuanced things that paying attention to emotions can reveal. And closer to my period, one book that I'm particularly fond of is Michael Roper's book called I can't remember what it's called now, but it's about emotional survival, secret battle, emotional survival in the trenches in World War I. And this is a book that shows how what we have often perceived as being a site of extreme alienation, of extreme separation between home front and the battlefront, out of which soldiers came back shell-shocked and completely broken, is actually also a site where social bonds were recreated through emotional bonds, both between soldiers in the trenches and, of course, by keeping contact with the home front. And so all of a sudden we have a much more nuanced picture of how these soldiers are actually experiencing a moment of extreme challenge for them, and that shows that it's not just a question of alienation, it's also a question of emotional survival. So I think in that respect, paying attention to emotions can really nuance little questions as well as very, very big questions. And I think your own work, Bill, obviously shows just how much emotions are implicated in moments of social change. I think in another form, people like Febvre have done this before, and Lefebvre, of course, also did it with emotional with the sort of emotions of crowds. And I particularly, I'm thinking of very recent work being done on the French Revolution now that has obviously taken on board the importance of emotions and the feelings and terror in the discourse of the revolution. So I think that there are many ways in which, just as Darrin was saying before, we have to be able to integrate emotions like gender, like class, like the colonies, or like the environment more recently. These have to be aspects of a histoire totale, much more total kind of approach to history.
Any problem of change? How to approach it? How to explain it? What can history?
Are you asking?
Understanding of change.
Are you asking me in particular?
I'm wondering if Barbara or Piroska want to come. Barbara.
Piroska has her hand up, so maybe Piroska, do you want to go ahead and then Barbara?
Yeah, I would just like to say on this issue of change that it's very interesting to put the question: is this very important dimension of human experience, which is emotion, is this something that can be, as most historians explain it, one of the dimensions by which change, historical change, is expressed or reflected, or can emotion also induce change in some way? And for this reason, I really like the proposition of Bill Reddy with the emotional navigation and with the emotives, which give a specific power to emotions, which intervene not only as a descriptive category to describe what happens on the affective level, but also which perform in some way something that changes the world. So I think that this is really something that has not been explored enough by late historiography. Perhaps, yes, around the revolutions, but perhaps not enough elsewhere. So that's what I would say. I like a lot this question and all this interrogation involves, in fact, because a lot of other questions come then: how it happens and when and why and in which circumstances.
Barbara, before you come in, let me just read a question from Alex Fairfax Chomley, who asks, in the context of historical change, is there a hierarchy developing within the history of emotions in terms of core versus peripheral emotions and their comparative roles as drivers of historical change? So perhaps you want to come in there, Barbara, and you can incorporate that into your response if you'd like.
Yes, because as a matter of fact, that issue is exactly what is occupying me right now. So thank you so much for asking about that. I mean, so far we've had really two paradigms. One is Stearns' paradigm that says that circumstances, social changes largely produce emotional changes that become more functional in new circumstances. So, and then there is Bill Reddy's idea that, in fact, emotions engender their own emotional refuges, which then come to the fore. And I'm interested in how marginal emotional communities at one period of time leave behind traces, you might say, certain practices, values, goals, and so on, that may be, not necessarily, picked up at a later time by another group and become more dominant. So that is exactly my model for emotional change as I'm trying to work it out in my newest book. So, thank you.
Thomas, we're almost at the end of our time, but I know you have your hand up if you want to come in quickly.
Yeah, the very last thing I wanted to add was that I think one thing that changes in emotions really helps us get a better sense of is how slowly change actually happens over history. I was amazed at how long it took for the word nostalgia to drop its medical connotations and to become a much more benign emotion that we associate with today. And it's remarkable that Chateaubriand, the great romantics, never ever used the word nostalgia in the temporal sense that we associate to them more so than anybody else. The change only happens much later. So I think in that respect, paying attention to emotions actually gives us a much more social and I would want to say socially significant perspective on changes in history that intellectual history might tend to attribute to a sort of one big text or one big moment in history. So I think that's one very important thing that the collaboration between intellectual history and emotional history can actually point out.
Very good. David, I see you have appeared on the screen. I'm see we're out of time. Perhaps what's left is to thank everyone for this very stimulating and fun conversation, and we barely skimmed the surface of some really significant issues.
And we can express our thanks directly under our emoticons by offering applause to all of our panelists for joining us and giving us a very interesting conversation. So thank you all very much. Darrin, did you want to say a word about the spring webinar?
Yeah, we're still in the process of organizing it, but it looks increasingly like we are going to do a spring webinar on environmental history. So that is another hot topic, and hopefully, like this one, we'll leave wanting to talk more, and that's the mark of the conversation.
Thank you,
more
everyone.
News on that coming soon. Yeah.
And the recording of this is will be preserved on the H. France Salon website, and we'll announce on H. France once that's up and available. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, David, and to all of you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you very much.